On the surface, Seward is a really cool spot, but it's below the surface that things start to get really interesting. Welcome to Seward, Alaska. This is mile 0 of the Iditarod Trail and Seward Highway, population 2,700 year-round, but also kind of the gateway of this transportation corridor in the Kenai Mountain-Turnagain Arm. So let's just dive right into it, literally and figuratively, by getting some water on your brush. I'm just going to kind of get some on the palette to play with here, and we're going to start with this sky right here, actually. So water on the brush, and I'm going to load up with a little bit of yellow. There's this wonderful kind of Alaska sky combination where it goes from yellow into blue. It's everywhere. I'm using some kind of, I don't know, what is this, cadmium or something yellow, but it's really kind of this glow that kind of goes from yellow into blue. So we're going to put a stripe of yellow, stripe of water, and stripe of blue, because if we mix them, they'll turn green. And so that's the real challenge. So I'm just going to dive right in, because that first line is always the scariest. Here's a little bit of that yellow. You could be kind of like going straight across if you want, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. And it's totally fine if you kind of dive into the mountains at this point. Rinse off my brush, and you can see I'm not painting within the lines too much, and that's totally okay. But then I'm going to add a little bit of water to the top of my yellow, just to kind of let it smooth out a little bit, create that nice gradient, just like that. And then finally, one more little stripe of water on top of that stripe of water, and then we're going to do blue to the top. We're just basically starting with the most complex thing first. It's going to get a lot easier after this, but this will kind of bring this whole landscape to life. You'll see, it's really fun. Next, I'm going to grab a bit of blue here. This one is cerulean blue, but any light blue will do. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that stripe up here. Nothing too wild, but enough to be bold. And then I'll rinse off that brush. Basically do the same thing. A little bit of water, just touching that. And eventually those waters will kind of connect, the wet part on my sky and the wet part on this sky. And once that kind of happens on its own, you can kind of just leave them to do their thing. It's like, introducing some friends or matchmaking or something like that. You just got to make the introduction. They'll take care of the rest. But you don't want that green, so you got to almost be pretty careful not to mix that yellow with the blue. But that is kind of the classic Alaskan morning sky as we work through the rest of this really fun little landscape. So we've got our sky drying right there, and we're going to kind of work light to dark. So here is our kind of underwater scene. We've got a little bit of rocks and things there. Here is the above ground kind of scene. Little person, little sea otter kind of standing there in the foreground, person in the background, looking at the beach. And this is kind of right on that mile-long trail in Seward, right there on the edge by downtown. So we're going to start by probably just filling in some of these lighter shapes, and then we'll kind of go light to dark. So we'll bounce all over the place here. So let's start with some of that. Some of these first lighter shapes we're going to add are maybe some of these like greens of these seaweeds down here. So we're going to kind of carve them out later. So here's a little bit of green. Not too much, but enough. I'm just going to add some green. You could also start with yellow if you have some on your palette. That's fine too. But you don't need to worry too much. You can see I'm really being pretty loose about those lines, because that is all going to be kind of carved out. You'll see. Be kind of quick and loose too with this brown. Just a tiny bit over here, maybe even a bit of blue actually, because I'm filling in those rocks that are going to be filled in a little later. So I'm just trying to cover them. I'm not trying to paint them in so much as I'm kind of trying to put that base coat of color. So we got kind of those, and once they dry, we'll carve them out with something darker. That's why we start light to dark. Up here, we've got this whole big ocean. Maybe we'll add a little bit right there, just to kind of get that rolling, as we're going to want to get this layer a bit later. So now I'm going to add a little bit of probably some of this blue. If you want to be super fancy, you could add a tiny bit of yellow. It would look something like this. Just grabbing a little bit of that yellow from my palette. If you want to be super fancy, you could add just a just an itty bitty reflection of that yellow, and then dive into the rest. But no pressure on the sea. I love painting the ocean because it's basically every color all at once, always. So you really can't go too wrong. That being said, it might take me 50 or 60 years to like get it too right. Watercolor's funny like that. So there's a little bit of that blue going on. Same technique, I'll probably add a little bit of water in between the two of them just to let them mix that way. But unlike the sky, we're also going to go deeper as well and kind of get some of these nice darker blues. But the below ocean is going to be much darker than that above ocean. So I'm just going to add a touch of maybe some Prussian blue or something slightly darker and mix that into the top right here. Absolutely not paying attention to lines. You can see that sea otter is all kinds of colors right now. But by painting the light stuff first, when we do come into those darker colors, they'll basically kind of go over top of whatever we do. That's looking really good. I am loving seeing all this come together. And as it's slowly drying, we'll kind of move back into those other sections. And now let's fill in this little sea otter right here as well. So we've got a little sea otter and we've got some little sea urchins, which is one of the things they love. Well, the sea otters are basically ocean dogs. They'll go for whatever. And so I'm going to add just a little touch of this brown, a little bit of that burnt sienna I've got, that cookie color, and I'm going to fill in our sea otter right here. Sea otters are kind of cool because they do kind of have a white head, or at least some of them do, and it kind of gets whiter as they get older. So if you want, you could go kind of for the white sea otter. If you want fully brown too, you're still totally fine within sea otter colors. You kind of pick your age here. But if you do want a bit of white head, I might just suggest you add just a touch of blue. And what that does is it kind of gives it some shape and dimension. You can see I'm just getting one half, just the hintest of blue. But that right there kind of adds just a little bit of something for us. And then when we come in, we're going to fill this whole section with something much darker, and it'll really make this pop. Lastly, we've got these little tiny sea urchins down here. We're going to put a little bit of red or something like that. Although sea urchins come in basically every color. You got purple, you got kind of red. We could put some sea stars in there as well, but we're going to stick mostly with a little bit of the basics, not go too crazy. Even though I'm learning this gateway to the transportation corridor is just so full of life. And it's also been that way for a while. People have lived here for so long. It's absolutely incredible, but maybe we learn a little bit about that while we wait for all of this to dry and then dive into a little bit more of the history of this landscape right here. The area we now call Seward goes way back and has been really important. Obviously for the whole Kenai Mountain-Turnagain Arm Heritage Area, but also for all of Alaska, basically throughout its entire history, which is kind of wild. And I'm not just talking about the fact that the historical Iditarod Trail started here, or all of the wild shipping stories that all end in Seward, or the fact that Rockwell Kent, the super famous artist, used to row from Seward to his home on Fox Island. We'll get into all of that during the series, but right now I'm talking about the old history. Like the original people who lived here, like the Katuchek or the Alutiiq, and all of the plants and animals that made this place home, making the place we now call Seward one of the most important places in Alaska. When most people think about the wild places up here in Alaska, they tend to think of the stuff on land. You know, the bears, the wolves, the foxes, the mountains. But often those summits are actually deeply connected to the coastlines below. And Alaska has a lot of those. In fact, Alaska has more coastline than the rest of the US put together. And below those waves lies a wild world that is just full of life. It's often kind of hidden to the view of the shore, but it does have a massive impact on all of the rest of Alaska. And nowhere is that a better example than in Seward. Standing on the shore where we're sketching, some of the more common things to see are the eagles, the birds, sea lions, and of course the sea otters, which we are sketching. What we don't see are the massive kelp forests, or the whales, the spot prawns, the crabs, the salmon, this whole ecosystem that really kind of supports a lot of what Alaska is. Probably one of the most well-known examples of this interconnectedness is salmon, which have been traveling to Alaska for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. This is one of the tastiest fish, but is also really unique because it travels from the ocean to fresh water. In fact, that's where it hatched, in some of these streams all along some of Alaska's very, 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 very long coast. These little fish swim back into the ocean where they grow up, eat all kinds of ocean stuff, and then travel back to those exact same streams years later. They'll head there in the thousands, feeding tons of animals along the way, from bears to eagles to us. And once they reach those streams, they don't just lay their eggs and turn around and swim back to the ocean. They do this strange thing and die. They just kind of give up a little bit, and all of that nutrients in their bodies just sort of sinks into the ground. But what it's actually doing is revitalizing this entire ecosystem. The banks of the streams to the scavengers to really anything that needs that nutrients flourishes because of that, including all of the ecosystems that support these little tiny eggs and those salmon babies, which then complete the cycle. And Alaska is full of these cycles. Everything from migratory birds to whales to more fish. Alaska plays just a super important role in tons of species all over the globe. And by extension, that's what's created these transportation corridors, as people and animals and industries travel to and from these really important places, like Seward. Just like the ocean, this deep history is kind of below the surface, but it's also part of everything you see here, from the salmon we eat to the sea otters we see. Alright, now it's time to paint in the rest of this wild landscape. So we'll kind of start with the mountains, work our way down, and then we'll paint in some of the details like this last sea otter and the whale. So I'm going to start with something kind of light for these back mountains, kind of that Fox Island area, and then we'll work our way up. So here is a little bit of just some blue. Really, we're going pretty light here. You don't need to worry too much about it. But that's kind of how things look, is they're lighter in the background, they're lighter and more blue, and then as you get closer, they get more and more colorful. So we don't even have to wait for this to dry. We can already just jump into maybe some purple or something and just add that along. Something like this. Well, that's maybe too dark. But the beauty with watercolors, you can always add in just a little bit more water and kind of smooth everything out. So say you do something a little too dark like that, you can just get something a bit more watery and then add it in. And what this does is something really cool called a bloom, where it actually creates this really cool texture. You can almost see a little bit here in this sea otter, but you'll see it really clearly here as I kind of go over top of this next one. But as that watercolor kind of blooms around, it'll make this great little texture. Almost looks like mist or something from those mountains. Even add a little bit of a drop of water if you want to really accentuate that. So wait for this to dry, and while we do it, let's work our way kind of in this big old C pattern here. Moving kind of quickly just to work through some of this and let it dry in time. But also, I find watercolor works best when you're a little sloppy, which sounds silly, but sometimes we try to be too controlled, and it's the movement that makes these fun. So if I'm going too fast, you can always pause, but it's kind of fun to try to keep up too. All right, here we go. Here's some burnt sienna. Filling in this little beach right here. Nice and light. And this is where we start to go underground, or below the surface in this case. So we got our little beach. I might add just a bit of water here on the edge just to let it kind of pull all the way over. But so we got our little beach right here, and then we've got this section down here. And I'm not actually going to add anything to it yet because I don't want these to mix. But if there's enough rocks, then it could be okay. But I'm going to give it just a moment for this beach to dry. And now we're going to go over to this kind of underwater section. But it's the same idea. We're going to start carving out these rocks. So instead of painting, this lighter, we're going to leave this how it is and paint everything else darker. But you'll see it works out really well. So we'll start here, which is going to be a little bit of a scary moment, but it's going to work out great. Mix up a bunch of blue, and mix that into all the purple and all the rest of the mess we have on a palette. And we're going to be pretty careful with this. Usually watercolor can be loose, but for instance on here, you see this is kind of a messy edge here on my ocean. When I add this darker blue, you could never tell that there's anything there. So that's kind of why it's okay to be a bit more loose. But we're just gonna fill in everything right here. We got our wave, we've got the tops of these seaweeds, we've got everything. Just being nice and careful, but also quick and maybe a tiny bit precise, but not too precise. And you'll see what was just kind of some loose color all of a sudden starts becoming these shapes. And it might feel like you need to get everything perfect, but you really don't, not with these. If you make this seaweed a little shorter than maybe it was in the outline or something like that, no one will really notice. So have some confidence on that. And I'm just working my way up, trying to do everything while it's still relatively wet, because that will give a nice smooth look to everything. But then really carefully working around our little sea otter here. And because we added in all of that good kind of color beforehand, it makes this really fun kind of perfectly proportioned, perfectly kind of toned character. Look how that's turning out. Pretty cool, right? Now if you want to get a little bit fancy, you could always add something slightly darker, maybe some indigo, maybe some purple, do have blue for these lower layers. And that just gives a little bit different of a gradient. But so long as what you're using is kind of cool and dark, you're going to be totally fine. Just a little bit down into these sea otters, which seem just omnipresent. But it's so cool thinking about the history and kind of wildlife in these waters. I so often think of like a transportation corridor as, something that involved trains or something that was just purely had to do with like man-made movement. But thinking of the migrations that kind of move to and from these shores is so cool, especially when you can't quite see them and just a little bit below the surface like that. Okay, how's that? It was quick, but don't second guess yourself. I think it probably looks perfect, so you can leave a lot of that right there. Almost time to do the same down here, but we'll give it just a moment to dry, and perhaps we'll give a little bit of attention up here. Almost like we're doing this big old spiral, but really we're just waiting to see what's dry and what's not. As I can see, like this right here still has a little bit of work. So if we're gonna add just a little bit to these details up here, what that would look like is probably just grabbing, honestly, a little bit of that dark blue that's on your palette. And with these waves, you basically pick one side of them and only paint one side, and that's what gives you a nice smooth movement. So right here I've got this wave kind of crashing, and I'm just gonna paint just one side of it, just something like that, and boom, got a little bit of kind of that wave look, maybe a bit more water in there, and there we go. It kind of starts to feel like a wave. Maybe you try it with a little bit more dark blue on this side as well. And then water is your best friend, so always don't be afraid to just add a little bit of water to one edge and just let it play out. It's amazing how well it works. You can even add a tiny bit to this other otter here before you kind of fill it in, just a touch. And then of course with that water, there's really no wrong answer because it kind of bleeds throughout and just it looks really good basically no matter what. So something kind of like that. Two more waves. Maybe we got this one right here. Maybe look on the outside of that, and then of course there's our whale, so we can kind of add a little bit of ripples if we want, but mostly this is just some interesting texture. And this is already starting to look pretty good. We have a couple little things left. We got our little person, we got this mountain, and we got down here. And so we can try out the little mountain. Sometimes a way to kind of move things forward is you can just grab a little bit of tissue paper or toilet paper or paper towel or whatever you got close by, your friend's jacket, whatever absorbs paint. You can just kind of blot a little bit just to make sure that it is dry. You can see this one. I went a little bit overboard with the water, but that's just to kind of make sure that this mountain doesn't mix into that one. But you can kind of see that cool bleeding kind of bloom effect is already happening. So this mountain is the closest to us, so it's going to be the darkest and the kind of most colorful. Might add a touch of green to my blue. This is kind of sort of the area a little bit by Seward, almost Miller's Landing area here. So adding a little bit up to this mountain, just like that. That is starting to look great. Watercolor is great because it's this really simple thing, but as these things build, the picture kind of comes to life in front of your eyes. I might add a tiny bit of blue to the bottom of it. Sometimes that's a fun little kind of combo. There we go. We're definitely doing kind of a spring summer sketch here, because in the winter a lot of this is this wonderful kind of almost like nostalgic kind of wintry colors. A lot more grays, but it's more colorful than that for some reason. Okay, so got a lot of that going, which is looking great. So we work our way around. Let's jump right here, maybe even add a bit more brown to the shore here. These little details are going to kind of build it up. So I've got a bit more of my brown. Maybe I'll mix in a touch of purple. But we want it a little darker because then you can do something like this. I want this. Just adding a little bit to this layer, it makes that feel kind of wet, almost that wet sand look. Even though it's mostly cobblestones, I'm just adding some brown kind of for that color. And then a little bit of that water to the edge to kind of soften it up. That's looking great. Now it might be time for these rocks right here. Exact same thing we did down here with all of this. We're just going to kind of scoot around the rocks instead of an otter. And that's going to give us kind of this cool cross-section view. So I'll probably start with some brown up top. Some burnt sienna I got right here. Just a little bit of brown right there. Avoiding those little rocks that we added just a touch of color to earlier, and that's all they really need. You don't want pure white paper, but even off-white is just enough kind of complexity. And then, once we have that, maybe you add some purple, just touching these layers. That's just so cool. You don't need to even like kind of work it in. A little bit of purple right here. Kind of working deeper into those kind of dark colors to kind of give this cool view. What I'm really hoping to show with this too is like these places go so far below the surface. I mean, you might see a pretty landscape, you might see kind of a cool place, but the history and the landscapes and the natural connection in a spot like Seward, or just honestly anywhere within the Kenai Mountains-Turnagain Arm, like this whole heritage area is so deep. It is so cool. So sometimes it's fun to actually like paint that and physically see these things. Okay, a little bit of indigo after I put some blue in there. Kind of just stacking those all together, and obviously avoiding these rocks as well, just because I want to get that cool cross section. Bit more in there. These last little details will all kind of fall into place. Perfect. You can also always come back in and add other little bits. You can use white color pencil or all kinds of other things if you wanted to add a bit more, maybe a rock or two or something else like that. You can also add in a bit of color if you want to while it's wet. Like here's a tiny bit of blue. And if I add just a bit into this rock while it's wet, it'll kind of pull in the rest of the colors. So you kind of want that look more. But we've got just a couple more things to add here before it's done. So let's move into kind of the fine detail phase and just almost zoom right in. So we've got these little noses and things of the otters, and that is basically going to be some of the most detailed work we have. So I'm actually blotting off my brush a little bit of that tissue paper that I had earlier, because I want it just really, really fine, very fine point. And I might grab just a touch of that indigo. You can kind of see my brush is just, because it's not too wet, it's not too loaded, it is just real sharp. And I'm just going to fill in this little nose and mouth. But you can also do this with a pen or a colored pencil if you want. If you want kind of that very, very controlled feel, that is totally fine to mix media. But there we go, a little bit on that nose. This otter up here I'm going to make a bit younger. So I'm actually going to wipe that off. And I'll make this otter, maybe I'll add a little bit of brown, kind of give a bit more of that face. So here we go. Kind of our younger otter up top, our veteran otter down below, and of course those little tiny otter feet where they come up and they kind of break open their sea urchins or clams or crabs or whatever they found. We'll give that a second or two to dry before we add in that nose. And then finally, that little whale up here. And by little whale, I mean absolutely gigantic, enormous creature, and I can't believe they come into this bay-sized whale. Just like that. We're almost there, because the only thing missing is yourself, which you could sketch in however you want. I just kind of put a basic person there, but feel free to add hair or a backpack or a coat or any color you want, because it's always kind of fun to paint yourself into a picture. It's like these little tiny vacations you can take. You can add whatever kind of hair. I'm gonna add a hat, I think, to this person, because it is kind of always hat season, no matter where you are in Alaska. And then last, we've got just a couple little things. Maybe wait for those pants to dry just a tiny bit before we add color to them. But I'm gonna add a little bit of a shadow, something like this. Looks like it's a little wet there already, but that's okay. Just a little bit of indigo off to one side is just enough to really add some three-dimensionality to everything, which really makes it very fun. And lastly, all we need to do is just add a couple of these little tiny details, and then there we go. We got the first of 4 in these little Seward panoramas. Dove a little bit into the wildlife, but this place goes so far below the surface. There's so much more to share, and I can't wait to paint everything, but this is such a great little vista to start, and I am so glad to be on this journey with you. Breaking